Welcome everybody again to this Carl Jung on Becoming Yourself series. Today we are going to focus on Carl Jung's concept of anima and animus. And we've got an incredible panel of people here. We've got, give me a second here. So we've got Brian Knuckles. We're going to get Skip. I don't think he's in yet. We've got Richard Owen. We've got Paul Jenkins, and we've got George. And what we're going to do is that I'm going to ask some basic questions, open-ended questions to them about these concepts of anima and animus. And then they will have 5 to 10 minutes to talk about their thoughts on the concept. That gives them tremendous amount of flexibility to bring up whatever they want to bring up. And after they're done, they will each have a question for the panel. And after those questions are answered, then we'll come to your questions. So you can keep asking your questions in the chat, and I will line up all the questions and we will go through all the questions. After the questions are done, we are going to break out into small rooms of about 8 people each, so we can discuss these concepts in great amount of detail. And we will do 2 rounds of those. So we'll talk first for about 25 minutes, and then I'll bring everybody back into the main room and reshuffle the room. Okay, so that's what we're going to do. That's the plan. All right. So with that, let me see. I'm going to go in the following order. So this is again, the topic is anima and animus, concepts by Carl Jung. The questions for the panel are: what are anima and animus? Second, what can integration of anima or animus into your personality do for you? And how do you do it? Those are the 3 kind of general open-ended questions for the panel. So it's going to be Paul Jenkins first, then Richard Owens, then Brian Knuckles, then George, and then Skip. So Paul, take it away.
Good afternoon, everybody. Still morning here in California, but afternoon for where most are all. By the way, it's interesting you mentioned Sapolsky. I recently finished Believe. I am completely in a bromance with Sapolsky. He's who I want to be when I grow up as a scholar.
Then please join us on Monday. We're going to have lots of people who have read the book talking about the book. So that would be great.
I absolutely want to. It's great
Excellent
stuff. And actually, it's an interesting connection because when I think of the whole issue of anima and animus, we know at the surface level, this is the idea of the internal gender, the internal female or male within the psyche. And so each of us has within us that deep set of attitudes, beliefs, of a psychological perspective or position that is connected to femaleness or maleness. And that's where I run into all sorts of problems with this, because I just don't know for the life of me how to separate that idea, that concept, from all of the cultural overlays that we have to work with when it comes to the identification of psychological attributes as being feminine or masculine. And then you add to that the complicating factor of genetics and biology, where we know there are certain influences on the psyche from the biology of gender. For instance, if you take female embryonic rats and you shoot them with testosterone, when they're born and they grow up, they are very much more aggressive and socially unempathetic than other female rats. So we know that biology has a role to play in something we call gender. And we know that culture has an enormous amount to play in what we call gender. Then we have to sort of figure out, how do we integrate those truths with something we might call a collective unconscious aspect of gender. And I'm not sure, I'm really honestly not sure how to do that conceptually, because we're talking about so many things that are below the level of full knowledge or awareness. I do have a more common sense type of approach to this, which is that I have noticed in myself and other people that to the extent that I and they sort of deny the aspects of their psyche that are at least stereotypically associated with the other gender, there tends to be a sort of a one-sided attitude, a lack of full self-awareness, and a tendency to project onto the other gender a lot of either a lot of inflation, to use a Jungian term. People get into either a negative or a positive or a combined projection of stereotypical qualities that are associated with that gender. I see that you see this a lot, particularly the negative side. So one of the things that I explored in terms of Anima was the internalization, or I should say the rejection, the psychological rejection of aspects of what we consider feminine, and inflating it into a monstrous type of character. So I actually wrote my master's thesis on the psychological image of the vampire. And one of the ideas I explored was about the male fascination with the imagery and the energy of the vampire, partly as a negative inflation of rejected anima. In other words, to the extent that we reject those aspects of ourselves that are empathetic, that are about connecting, and most importantly, about the earth, about actual earthly physical appetites, we tend to project that onto monsters. We create monsters in the culture, we create monsters in our life. And one thing I think probably holds true in terms of image of or ideas that are connected to anima is the earthiness of the feminine. The female is the one that recreates physical life. And this was recognized very, very early on in our anthropological heritage. And so the female became, had those, the characteristics of an earthbound physical life projected onto everybody of that gender. And to the extent that we don't want to live just one earthly, physically bound life, we want to be pure spirit, we want to live forever, we want to be unchained from this physical realm, there becomes this negative inflation. We make it evil, we make it a monster, we make it a dragon, we make it a vampire, we make it all these negative things that are basically deep at the core of our conscious revulsion and desire to escape from an earthbound existence. This is where you get the image of the Ouroboros, where you have the manifestation of eternity that's within this image of the snake that's biting its own tail. And you have the image of Satan being a serpent who tempts Eve, thus associating her with this earthly manifest, or the earthly life, the physical existence. Because remember, in the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve ate from the tree of knowledge. In other words, they became conscious. That was the birth of consciousness. And what God said was, we must cast you out from the garden so that they would not eat from the tree of eternal life. Because consciousness is what gives us our knowledge that we're all going to die. And nobody wants that. So the utter horror of physical existence is part of the negative inflation of the anima, and I think the villainization of women in many cultures, mostly Western, but also in other places around the world, because of the female association with the manifest earthly life. Okay, I think I spun out of control on that one.
Oh, that was wonderful. Thank you very much, Paul.
Oh, by the way, I'm sorry, quick note, because you had 3 questions, very quick note. So in terms of dealing with it, just to be very simple and straightforward about it, you gotta own it. You gotta integrate it. I gotta accept my horror of death, my horror of having to live this darn earthly life, my desire to be a pure spirit and float up into the ether of oneness with the universe, and not accept that as part of my own psyche, my own reality, and not project it onto half of the population of the planet.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Paul.
Okay.
Folks, you can keep asking questions, and presenters, please ignore all the questions at this point. Just say, put your thoughts on the table, and we will come to all the questions in line, when we come to the Q&A period. So it's going to be Richard, then George, then Brian, then Skip. So Richard, go ahead.
Hi everyone. So yeah, here I am in Brighton in the UK. You can see the West Pier behind me. I'm not on the beach, but it's about 20 minutes walk from where I am. So I'm in the UK, obviously, and I'm a trustee of the British Association for Psychological Type. That's kind of my specialist area in Jungian studies, I guess, and it's led me into a lot of the other deeper areas of Jung as well. I'm really into studying John Beebe and his work as well, his depth typology. So you'll hear more of that next week, where I'm going to do a presentation. The Anima and Animus, it's a very deep aspect and something that's part of Beebe's model as well. And I'll probably go into it more next week in that relationship with his model specifically. But the way I see it is, these are qualitative aspects of the human mind, of the human psyche, that are universal to all of us, hence the archetypal, from the collective unconscious. They are aspects that are inherent to our evolutionary makeup. So we've got these 2 qualitative aspects, and they've been put onto this projective male and female kind of way of looking at it. Do you mind if I share my screen, Shrikant? Because then I can show something. Screen. Okay, that's not the first. That's going to come to this in a minute. So first, I was looking at a bit of Jung here, and this is in Collective Works 9, in this concerning the archetypes with reference to Anima, Animus. So, he's talking here about one of my favorite subjects, the yin and yang from Chinese philosophy. He's saying that essentially these aspects of our psyche have become seen as projections, like as in we project them onto that which is a good hook, like we do with all projections. And the man and woman, the male and female, have seemed like ideal hooks for these projections of these qualities, which he's saying are more metaphysical. They go deeper than that. They're not about man and woman. They're about what you could broadly call masculine and feminine, but in a philosophical sense that leads all the way back through Gnosticism and Chinese philosophy, to the yin and yang concepts. One of the places I've got my thoughts on Anima and Animus is this book, which is not easy to see in that mode. It's Emma Jung's wife wrote this. It's the Animus and Anima, she says it that way around, 2 papers by Emma Jung. And it's just really good short stories showing about the background of how these archetypes are shown in mythology and folk tales and stories and so on. So I'm going to go back to some ideas that having read this book and made notes and things, and having studied a bit of Chinese philosophy, because I also run the I Ching meetups in London as well. So here's a bit of what I'm thinking of what the metaphysical aspects of these qualities are, which we're getting to. So on one side, you've got the yin, which is usually shown as the black side of the Tai Chi diagram. This yin, feminine. These are some of the qualitative aspects: yin, feminine, earth, matter, yielding, receptive, being, contracting inwards, versus the yang, masculine, heaven, energy, firm, creating, doing, expanding outwards. So, this is sort of more of the qualities of what we're talking about, which have then become projected in this man and woman sense. But this is more the metaphysical side of it. Then you've got the sort of stuff from the book that I was just showing you here. Some of the qualities that she describes about relating to the anima, and I'm relating to the soul and the unconscious because of she's talking about following, adapting, experiencing, relating, connecting, the very sensual side to the anima, and contrasted with the animus, which soul is literally the translation of anima, and spirit the translation of animus. So consciousness, logos, knowledge, power, word, deed, meaning, understanding. These are some of the aspects that are associated with Animus. So you can see sort of the side they're going, broadly this side here, the soul, we're not talking about soul as in something that flies off when you die and live forever. It's more like the qualitative aspect of the unconscious, the soul, that the mind expressing, that has its own way of being, that you as an ego observing and doing in the world have to essentially yield to. And that's what this is about, really, this yielding to the unconscious, yielding to what is happening and just a being. Whereas there's a much more sense of the consciousness of the doing, of the action, of the intention with this other side here. So you've got sort of a power dynamic, on one side a drawing in, a pulling towards and enticing, on the other side a pushing and a making things happen. So finally, I'll just finish with this. When I was seeing a Jungian analyst a few years ago now, it was back in like 2014, I think. I remembered this picture that had a strange sort of numinous quality for me when I was younger, when I was at university, actually. I ended up buying this in a student art fair and having it on my wall. It's a painting called Hylas and the Nymphs. It just had a magical quality to me. And actually going to see in this Jungian analysis, it became clear, like symbolically, what that had really meant. As a young man, having this really, this one-sided ego consciousness developed, very sort of, for me, intuitive and thinking, very logical, very rational, very action-orientated consciousness. What I was missing was surrendering to and being and letting the unconscious and the sensation and the things that were happening become part of my world. So this is very symbolic for me. These nymphs are like a lot of anima sort of symbols in folklore. They are this enticement into the depths of the water. And actually in the story, Hylas gets pulled into the depths and doesn't come back. He actually gets lost in the unconscious. And that's part of the risk. So ultimately, I think this is a process on a power dynamic. On one side, the anima challenge of surrendering and yielding to that which just is happening, and the animus challenge to rise to that which seems impossible and above oneself. So that's what Emma Jung talks about in the book, these two different challenges. And ultimately, I think the mind, the psyche, it wants that to happen. And ultimately, we need to support that process. We can't just make it happen. It's a thing that is going to happen if we let it and support it. And, we can do that through relationships, through therapy, through living and opening ourselves to what is not part of our consciousness normally. There we go. That's what I'm going to say for now.
Thank you, Richard. That was amazing. Next up is George. George, go ahead.
Hey, good afternoon. Again, thank you, Shrinkat, and everyone else. Late evening for some of you. What is Anima? What is Animus? I guess as a preface, I would like to say that I'm approaching this question from a particular, I'm approaching psyche from a particular perspective. In this case, the analytical psychology. I don't want to dismiss the social cultural element. I don't want to dismiss the genetics element. I think they're all inextricable, and I encourage everyone to do that in their own way. You know, depending on the circumstances in one's life. But I do want to underscore that I'm approaching psyche I'm using a particular typology that has been given to me by Carl Jung. You know, there are other ways of approaching psyche. I do want to say that that approach has nourished clarity for me, yet simultaneously it has promoted confusion. You know, I lose my clarity, I lose my balance, I feel confusing. Anyway, and I do agree. I think if I understood Paul correctly, I think he said it. I think there is a metaphysics here. So we need to be careful with that. You know, it gets quite elusive. I think metaphysics in itself gets elusive. Any encounter with the noumenal becomes elusive. And I think that's where I'll start. I think the anima animus, the syzygy, as Carl Jung calls it, in, or refers to it in volume 9, part 2 of Eon. And I like that term because it seems to me when there's the birth of the ego, as I demonstrated last time, and when there's repression, we spoke about shadow. But I think with the birth of the ego, simultaneously, you have this differentiation of psychic energy, of libido, which we call anima animus. One aspect emerges, one aspect evolves consciously, the other aspect remains unconscious. So this emerges, that remains subliminal. Yet it's not repressed material, it's dormant material, it's transpersonal material that remains psychically dormant. And there is a tension between these two. And I think Richard just said that it is a power struggle. I think it was Richard or Paul. I think there's a power struggle between these dynamisms. So what do I extrapolate from that? Well, if you have a correspondence with the material that's unconscious, be it anima or animus, that which completes you, that psychic element which completes you. June Singer calls it androgyny. You know, I like that term. Integration works, but androgyny for me resonates much more. If you experience androgyny, you're able to approach life in a much more integral manner. So this particular ego needs its feminine. It needs to relate to the inner feminine, or this particular ego needs to relate to the inner masculine energies. Okay, and respectively, they're known as eros or logos or anima or animus. I think when you read Jung, it becomes problematic. At least when I read Jung, it becomes problematic because he's, you know, they talk about classical Jungian thought, you know, and Jung and even Edinger, you know. I think it becomes problematic when you hear terms like the contrasexual. I'm not sure if a particular ego, and biologically, I don't want to throw in biology, but biologically is perceived to be a male. I'm not sure if that particular ego, repressed material, is an anima. I think that's problematic, and vice versa. If the ego is genetically, biologically a female, I'm not sure if that ego needs to relate to its animus. I think it's quite idiosyncratic. That's why I like to use the term that it's that which completes you psychically. And ultimately, I don't think you can integrate that material. I don't think you can integrate any transpersonal material in one's life. I think it could be quite toxic. I think one can relate to it. One can embrace with it. I think someone said earlier on, I think someone used the phrase, you could dance with the material, but you can't really integrate it. I think it could be quite dangerous. Again, when I say this, I'm approaching psyche from a Jungian, from a classical Jungian point of view. Okay, so the anima is the inner feminine within us. The animus is the inner masculine within us. And they're both quite seductive elements. I mean, once we experience, and usually we experience anima, animus spontaneously. It happens usually through accidents. I don't think any, and culture can facilitate that. You know, you see an image and it ignites something which completes you. You feel an intuition. You feel an attraction, and you can investigate it. But I think to intentionally, you can do intentional work with regard to shadow work, but to do intentional work towards transpersonal material, and I always say the anima and the animus as terms to allude to a psychic dynamism. And that's what they are. They're these dominants. Jung, in his early material, doesn't use the term anima, animus, archetypes. He uses the word dynamisms, you know, these dominants. Particularly his first English translation of the transformation and of libido energy. Later on becomes symbols of transformation. But when you read the early essays, he uses the words, these dynamics, these dominance, and I think they're much more appropriate for me. So they are highly seductive. They have potential, but to attempt to integrate them, I think, can be quite problematic. And we could go back, unpack that a little further. I'm trying to think what else I can say descriptively with regards to anima and animus. I think we usually, well, I mentioned it, I just mentioned it. I think the way that we do encounter this inner feminine or this inner masculine energy, that which completes us, again, it's accidental, and particularly that it occurs through projections. I mean, Jung in his essay calls the anima in particular, this projecting, making entity. And that's what I mean by accidents. You can have within your particular narrative, within your particular story, you can cultivate a certain intimacy with certain images. So in classical Jungian literature, you talk about the mother, you talk about the again, for me, that's problematic. I think a lot has to do with your particularly in England, the object relationship folks with what's his name, Fordham, I think it was, started unpacking this stuff. And I think in the beginning, Melanie Klein and those guys sounded Jungian, but they developed their own vocabulary. But I think a lot has to do with your primary caretaker with regards to cultural images. And in this case, in a general context, the image usually is mother, but I'm not sure if mother, mother can be quite problematic if we use traditional cultural images. I think mother alludes to that which gives you birth, this matrix that gives you birth. Biologically, it's the female. And if you look at Jung's work, it's really about masculine psychology. And that makes sense because that which gave birth to Jung was a woman. But imagine Jung was a female. His psychology would be completely different. The psychology of a woman, the psychology of merit, a lot has to do with this. And I promised myself I didn't want to bring biology into the conversation, But I think we need to consider that. You know, imagine if you're born out of your father, what would be the ripple effects, and how would a depth psychology be constructed surrounding those particular experiences? But I guess that's too hypothetical. But ultimately, the anima animus is that psychic dynamisms that completes the ego person, or the ego personality. Because the one of the tensions that or one of the analogies you can have with the anima animus is persona. The anima animus is those dynamisms that heralds one's encounter with transpersonal material, subsequent other archetypes. I think I spent enough time on what is anima and animus. I guess the other question is, how does one integrate anima and animus? I believe I responded to that. I don't think if one, and I think it was, I forgot, someone earlier said that one needs to have a strong ego, a stable ego. Definitely when you encounter shadow, but if you're going to encounter transpersonal dynamics like the anima and the animus, you need to have a stable ego. If not, you will get overwhelmed. I think it was Paul, he talks about inflation that will occur. One of the stories I want to share with you, perhaps as an analogy or as allegory, comes from the Symposium, Plato's Dialogue, and they're addressing the question, what is love? And I don't remember if it's the second or third. I don't think it was the first, but I think it's the second or third. I don't remember the character. They talk about that when humans were born, there were these big balls, all males, all females, some were androgynous, and then Apollo split them. You guys remember that story in the Symposium? If not, I encourage you to read it. But that, for me, that's a wonderful allegory with regards to the birth of the ego. When the ego is born, it's split. And the ego becomes culturally either erotic or logocentric, and the other aspect becomes remains dormant. And throughout our myth, throughout our personal myth, we're trying to experience androgyny again. So I think that Platonic response to what is love, again, love is this intimacy between ourselves. It's for all our fragmentations to unite. And for me, that's psychic energy, and that's going to lead to my final question. But it seems to me that throughout our lives, we're striving towards wholeness, and one of the way, and on that path, a critical experience is these experiences with the contrasexual self, with that which completes you, with one's anima or animus. So for me, that Platonic story is about this the striving and this journey for what was once whole has been split. I guess you could use the story of Genesis, the creation myth as metaphor, is striving to unite itself again, to integrate. And love, and Jung talks about in his stages of life, he talks to us about that, and Newman unpacks that much further. So is this integration, this movement towards androgyny. And I guess your last question is, how do you do integration? That's a tough one. I guess it's related to the second one.
Let's, George, how about keeping that for the panel discussion and Q&A, because there are going to be lots of questions about that.
Okay.
Okay. Thanks, George. This is great. Folks, I just want to talk about two logistical things. So firstly, this is an educational and information meetup. This is not like clinical consultation for no conversation here is that. So that's one thing. And second thing is that we record these meetups for posting on YouTube. So if you want, you can keep your video on or video off. That's completely up to you. Okay. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Brian. Brian.
Awesome. Thanks, Shrikant. So yes, thanks to my awesome co-panelists for the really thought-provoking and interesting presentations they were giving. Going to be building off a lot of what they were saying. But to just start, to follow my fellow panelists, I think starting with the discussion on gender, I think is important. It's kind of the elephant in the room with Anima and Animus. And I'm just going to go back to Homer and the Odyssey and look at an Anima figure for Odysseus, who is Circe. And Circe gives Odysseus some advice for passing through the rocks called the plancti, which is the only sailor to have ever gone through these is Jason and the Argonauts. And there's rocks on either side, and you can get torn to pieces by either rocks. And I think this discussion on gender, especially in our current cultural moment, we can face a bit of a moment like that, especially if we want to reach this vision of the psychology of gender that's more from analytical psychology, or more what Paul was talking about, a kind of gender of the collective unconscious. I think we may have to pass through two pillars. And if we could just caricature two perspectives in this discussion in contemporary culture, we have biological essentialism, or our biology and our genetics are going to completely shape our gender, and then there's something kind of fundamental to sex differences, and then also complete relativism, so that our culture mediates our gender. I think either of those sides, we can get stuck on that. We need to kind of find a way through both of them and take the great points from both perspectives and try to bring them together to try to birth this psychology of the collective unconscious. And that's what I try to do. And I'm going to kind of leave it at that for gender and go into the Jungian stuff. But I think that's really important to consider. So I wanted to lead with that. And so with that said, the Anima archetype. So what is it? So first of all, the kind of numinous quality of the archetypes is huge. And I hope we can flesh that out in our discussions, in our questions, and maybe in our breakout discussions. But I'm going to really focus on a really interesting idea coming out of a book called Archetypes, a Natural History of the Self by Anthony Stevens. Really fascinating book where he does look at some of the biological links with the archetype. I think that's easier to flesh out quickly, but by no means can we reduce the numinous quality of the anima to this discussion, but I think we can get a lot from it. So there's an ethnologist by the name of Lorenz who's very fascinating. What he discovered was that the geese hawk effect, and so a geese chick who had never seen a hawk, if she or he sees the shadow of a hawk, freaks out and has a prey response. And so there's something innate in the goose that recognizes his or her enemy, her cosmic enemy, which is the hawk, and they'll run away. And this is something really interesting to think about with the anima, because there's certain archetypal experiences with the primary caregiver and with leaving the home and etc., learning to talk, taking care of ourselves, and just adaptively exploring the world that will release certain what they call in the ethology world fixed action patterns, which I think we can make a synthesis with archetypes. Like I said, we can't necessarily reduce them to fixed action patterns, but we can, I think, draw a comparison that is interesting. And as George was talking about, one of the primary texts in the Jungian world for anima is Ion. And I would definitely suggest getting that text, but I have my well-worn copy of the Portable Jung, edited by Joseph Campbell, and he has just the first part of that text in his embedded in his collection of essential Jungian texts, right? Also next to a really fascinating essay on marriage as a psychological relationship. And that's all. Those two things together, I think, can be really powerful to read to get the essence of the anima. But something he says in there that I think is very interesting. He calls the anima animus the projective factor, as George had mentioned. I think this is interesting, and we can kind of bring that together with another idea called introjection, which is the process by which we as people replicate behaviors, attributes, and fragments from the surrounding world and from our primary caregiver and make them kind of patterns. And it's interesting, if we bring that together with the fixed action patterns, it means that when we have these important experiences in life with archetypal experiences, we take on certain characteristics, or we model certain characteristics using this projective factor. And I think this is a good time to differentiate something we will call the archetype, that thing, whatever it is, that kind of metaphysical idea, whatever's coming with us in our ancestral legacy, that is the projective factor, that I will call the anima archetype. But we also have, and I think this is an easier way to feel into this personally and concretely, is something we might call the anima complex. And what I'll call by that is just the individual unique differences that we might have in primary caregiver relationships and those archetypal experiences I was mentioning, like, for example, going to school, leaving the home, exploring adaptively, learning to just bathe ourselves, et cetera. These early experiences, the individual differences things that go really wrong, for example, things that worked out particularly well for us, we can, through the process of the projective factor and the introjection, we can kind of explore our own life in an interesting way. And I think that is like kind of the essence of Anima work for me. However, I do just want to say, it's really resonating a lot with what Richard was saying as well. The Anima and Animus essay by Emma Jung, short, definitely suggest reading that. And she talks about, for the Animus in particular, well, I'll just say some keywords she uses there, like Richard did, empathy, relatedness, connectivity for the Anima and for the Eros, and boundaries, will, meaning, clarity for the Animus. But I'll just say she does this very interesting thing in Animus and Anima, this essay, especially for Animus, where she talks about this fourfold pattern of will, action, word, and meaning working together from. And I've recently wrote an essay on, I don't know if there's any Game of Thrones fans in the room, but Daenerys is a great example of this, just almost explicitly. She starts off with Khal Drogo, the man of power, and ends up with Tywin Lannister, the man of words and education. And her process of growth through that series is a really interesting story of Animus development. And she even names her dragons after her dead husband, father, and brother. And which oftentimes, in myth and fairy tales, the death of a character symbolizes the integration of that personality into the psyche. So something to keep in mind. So what can integration of Anima and Animus do for you? I think for the Anima especially, cultivating some, and this is coming from my own clinical and personal practice, but just some things I've seen. For the Anima, dealing with unexpected moods and just moodiness that come out of nowhere, and learning to, the poet Rilke was famous for this. He was able to transmute those experiences into great art, but sometimes that can be really paralyzing for us. Also, I think, there's a discussion of Stoicism. I think anyone who's explored Stoicism in the early phases might, well, I'll just say this is for me, I won't project it onto anyone else, but you might have the kind of faux Stoicism where at the slightest need for resilience, that kind of facade falls apart. And I think Anima work can really help us cultivate true resilience and true Stoicism by being able to cope with the ups and downs of life. Also, for the Animus, a big one, overcoming fears about your reputation and building an authentic brand and reputation for your life that isn't kind of mediated by what other people think is huge for that. Also, any issues with boundaries and assertiveness, and just less of a need for external validation. And then lastly, how do you do it? And so again, Richard really resonating with what he was saying, strongly suggest checking out John Beebe and his work. I think revisiting for animal work, introversion and extroversion, I kind of, it's such a part of our vernacular now. You can forget about how radical of an idea this is, especially when it's coming out of Jung. It's a very radical idea. And so just realizing that whatever aspect of that pole that we're resonating with, that we're more comfortable with deploying, that's going to be more wrapped up in personal and the personal and cultural unconscious. And so by going to the inverse pole, what BB calls the spine of personality, we can use a function that is closer to the unconscious, that is less influenced by the personal and the cultural, because it's just not deployed in those circumstances. And so that's something to really feel into. I'll say for what that means, just kind of schematically, is for if someone's an or identifies as an introvert, like trying to constellate the anima by external action, by travel, by meeting people, by finding what James Hillman calls the anima mundi, the soul in the world, and not the soul inside, the soul in the outside. And then finding the sensual and the physical and even the erotic. While for extroversion, trying to encounter the anima via interior image and trying to that inner illumination. And I'll end on this. I think something for anima work, realizing, finding there's a great alchemical dictum that Jung likes called "In filth it shall be found." And I won't butcher the Latin, but bravely and tirelessly encountering things that make us uncomfortable, and continuing to do that, I think is a great way to integrate the animus and anima. And I'll end with that one. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Brian. I just want to tell you folks about what is coming up. We're going to have actually Richard presenting on John Beebe's 8-function model. And that's going to be at 12 p.m. Eastern time next Sunday. And that we're going to follow that up with a 2:30 discussion on archetypes. Personally, I've found John Beebe's model to be really profound because it integrates two of the key concepts that I've learned most from Jung. And that is, one is the concept of archetypes and their role. And then second is the concept of psychological functions. And it's going to be a very special presentation. Richard is going to make a very detailed presentation, about 75 to 90 minutes. And then John Beebe himself will be joining us on the panel. So John Beebe and a gentleman called John Roth, who has been applying John Beebe's model to business as well as the American character. So there is an amazing book by a historian called David Hackett Fisher called Albion Seed, which talks about how American character came to be. And what John Roth has done is that he has looked at the American character from the perspective of John Beebe's 8-function model. So it's going to be a fantastic, it's going to be, you don't miss that, that's going to be amazing. Richard presenting the model, and then panel discussion between Richard, John Beebe, and John Roth. And that is going to be 12 o'clock next Sunday. All right, now Skip is not here. So I'm going to give George, we do have time. So if you could please answer the third part of the question. How do you do this? How do you integrate?
Okay, kind of caught by surprise there.
I'm sorry, I was surprised myself because I was expecting Skip to be here by now, but he's not. So we have additional time. So
yeah,
I
how do you integrate? I think my meter. Again, I find the question difficult because I'm unable to articulate this time. But intuitively, I feel that ultimately you don't integrate this transpersonal material. You just you learn to live with it. You learn to live with it. You learn to express it. Freudians call it sublimation. You learn to express it. You learn to express libidinal energies. In this case, anima stuff, animus stuff. But you don't really integrate it because when I hear the term integrate, for me, it directly implies the expansion of the ego. I'm not sure if archetypes and these transpersonal dynamisms can actually be incorporated within the ego. but the ego can certainly relate to it, you know, and then express it in one's narrative, you know. So that's one thing, and to sustain that, I would say the way, how do you do integration? I think it's two ways, two methods, and Jung explicitly states them. One is dream analysis, and the other one is to active imagination. If anything, those are the two, and technically, within classical Jungian approach, those are the two ways, the two methods for integrating transpersonal material. In this case, anima and animus, the contrasexual, that that constellation of psychic energy that completes the ego personality, you know, that we label anima and animus. So we can have an indirect approach to dream analysis and to active imagination.
Thank you, George. So now, Paul, Richard, Brian, and George, what question would you like to pose for your other panelists? Anybody can just, any of you can just unmute and ask your question.
I was just going to ask a really kind of back to basics question. For the panel, what's your understanding of an archetype? What is an archetype?
Who would like to take that? Paul, George, or Richard? Richard, go ahead.
What is an archetype? I mean, that way of phrasing it makes it sound like it's a thing that you can pick up and hold in your hand. You know, it's like, I mean, it's an ethereal concept, and that's, you know, it's the qualitative aspect of the psyche that is universal to all people. It's evolved into us. When it becomes a thing, it's when we do project it and we concretize it onto something that bears similar qualities that we can then attach it to. So, you know, the archetype of the trickster, you know, that's a set of qualities that have that certain slippery, mercurial way of being that kind of slips up, falls, and so on. But, you know, when something feels that it has those qualities, similar qualities out in the real world, we kind of squash the two together, and we sort of push that into a metaphor that we actually then can call, well, that's the archetype, that concretized metaphor that we've created. But that's really just a symbol. And, you know, Jung talks about the image. I think Jung was different to me personally. You know, he talks about the image as something, when this metaphorical linking takes place, you know, Jung would actually see in his mind's eye the actual image of that metaphor, the thing that is bearing those qualities, that he's chosen to represent those qualities. Now, I don't get that personally. I think I'm more, I've been talking to people about this, I'm more of an auditory, I think I experience archetype in music and sound through I'm not a visual internal person in the way I think Jung was. So the way he describes archetypes, you know, he actually sees images in his mind's eye that bear this metaphorical qualitative linkage. I don't personally, but I do see it as a conceptual thing that has a real relevance in expressing qualitative aspects of who we are.
George or Paul, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, that's another, again, elusive term. Sometimes I think I have clarity. Most of the times I don't, but I'll take a stab at it. Jung, I think, describes it as this, these constellations of centers of energy that it's almost like a chi, you know, like in Kung Fu. It's this force that will have some sort of effect to ego consciousness. And they get reconstellating, giving the epoch, they can become reconstellated, giving one's personal narrative. But are these constellations of energies, of psychic energy that has this effect? And he also describes it as these patterns of readiness for action. And I think that's a wonderful description. So archetypes are these dynamisms that are always unconscious. They never get expressed. You do not integrate them, but you experience them indirectly through projections. There's a diversity of projections. You know, one of my biggest frustrations is when people talk, when they see a film or they read a piece of literature and they say that archetype. That's not an archetype. That's an archetypal image. That's the end of this invisible metaphysical force that influence ego consciousness. So archetypes are dynamisms of the collective unconscious.
Thank you, George. Okay, next question. Which of you would you like? So Richard, George, or Paul? Do you have any question for the panel? Yes, George, go ahead.
Okay, I guess it's related to Brian's question, and I just mentioned it a few times, and I'll just throw it out there. What is psychic energy, or what is libido? Particularly how it relates to Anima and Animus, but.
Okay, who would like to take that?
I'll take a stab at it. It's a fascinating question, George. Thank you. And it's kind of bedeviling or beguiling, I should say, in the history of philosophy. Like, what is motivation? What causes the plant to flower? Even like, what is that thing in us that makes us want to move? That's been elusive, I think, through the history of philosophy and science. And I think for Jung, you know, you've got this. There's this interesting quote. I'm paraphrasing. It was so beautiful when he quoted it. It's like it's something like this: if the plant has its rhizome to flower, then the flowering of the human being is to become conscious or consciousness. And so there's something inherent. There's a telos in the human being that makes us kind of want to become more conscious and to have consciousness. And I think psychological energy can be wrapped up in that through this kind of fascinating idea of, you know, perhaps this is how I see the part of Jung's idea of the self, is that our self in our potentiality in the future is kind of manifesting itself in the present moment now through our attention, through what we're fascinated by. And so, and psychological energy is kind of the fuel for that, the mechanism for that the manifestation of our potential in the present, and through the mechanism of action that is kind of unclear. You know, psychological energy is kind of released to help us get towards it. Yeah, it's very, very interesting question, though. I'm curious what what the rest of the panel can contribute to that one.
Would Paul or Richard like to add anything or ask a question?
Let me jump in. I'm sorry, my Wi-Fi is really awful right now. I've missed big chunks as I've gone in and out. So I assume are we still on the question of what is an archetype?
No, hold on for a second. Let George had another question. George, can you restate your question for Paul, please?
Yeah, sure. What is psychic energy? What is psychic energy, or, you know, aka what is libido? You know, from analytical psychology framework.
What is psychic energy? I'm really not sure. You know what this reminds me of? There was something I saw a long time ago when Joseph Campbell was being interviewed, and I think he was referring to somebody else. He said, you know, the best things, the most important things in life cannot be talked about. The second, you know where I go with this, right? The second best things are the things that can just be pointed to. And the third best are what we talk about. So I think sometimes we get caught up in what's an archetype, what's psychic energy. They're pointing to something that really is beyond the limitations of our normal language, and that's why we end up sort of spinning in word circles. So I always like to bring it back down to something that I can actually experience, that I actually can touch and see, recognizing that it's pointing towards something greater than that. But I really, my brain cannot really encompass that. It can't go out there without going into the land of just words and symbols. I always feel the need to make it manifest, to bring it right down into a lived reality, and then I can appreciate the pointers to something beyond words. So when I hear the word energy, I'm immediately thinking, well, where do I feel that? Where is my experience of that? Rather than, talking about God, what's my experience of being in church? What's my experience of something that's really powerfully spiritual, that that I can actually wrap my psyche around in the here and now. So like when it comes to Anima and Animus, I really like working this through people's experience of relationships and their experience of projections in relationships and introjections in relationships, and how do you tap into those elements in ourselves that we've sort of thrown out there, or rejected in ourselves, or overinflated in ourselves. And then to the extent that brings the person alive, that brings energy to their day-to-day existence, that to me is psychological energy.
Thank you.
Beyond that, it just becomes a lot of word games.
Thank you, Paul. Richard, you're next.
Yeah, I just want to quickly I'm trying to bring this back to the ground a bit. I think, Paul makes a good point. The experiential is the side that we want to head for to really know what this means to us. I've read a bit about the libido and the concept and I think the place to look is Structure and Dynamics of the Psyche, Collected Works 8. And from that, I'm getting the idea that, something that has a large amount of psychic energy, or I think Neil might put it as like, a high charge. When something arises in the psyche that is powerful and explosive, and you can say within Beebe's model how the animus carries the inferior function, and the inferior function in typology is very related to stress reactions. It can be very explosive, when it gets triggered. It's repressed a lot of the time. And when it, sometimes when it comes out, you get gripped by that qualities of that anima or animus for you. It can be high energy, really high energy. So that's kind of an experiential aspect of how we know what libido is. We know when something explodes out of us, out of the psyche, and what that is to experience. And and conversely, when something doesn't have the energy to break through, when something is under the surface. So for me, that's a way of experientially quantifying amounts of energy. Can it break through and force itself upon us? Does it have that amount of energy?
Folks, we've got more than 8 questions lined up. So unless either Richard or Paul has a burning question that they would like to raise, I would like to move to the question. So Richard or Paul, would you like to ask a question to the panel, or shall I go ahead to the questions? Okay, Richard, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, about the experience of the anima and animus in dreams and fantasy. That's what I really like looking into that, and especially anima and animus dreams. Very powerful dreams. Often you kind of know when you've had one, and you meet somebody who might be like somebody in real life, who may share those similar qualities to your unconscious, and it becomes like they become a symbol of that in your dream, but it's them, but it's not them, but it's got, you can usually feel that something special about that dream. It was an anima dream for me. You know, it's usually this very sensuous female characters, you know, that are there, and there's something about them, you know, that I know that that's my anima. And when I started to recognize that, I could see it coming up. And I know sometimes people experience animus dreams as, you know, much more sort of scary, almost they're being pursued or harassed by these sort of single or groups of masculine characters that are, you know, tormenting or chasing them. Just curious about what your experiences are of your you know, animus dreams.
Well, it's a great question, Richard. I'm struck by the image you shared that you were so seduced by the photo of the nymphs, and I would almost say, you know, I think a characteristic of anima dreams that maybe on the surface they don't seem so dangerous, but maybe the animus dreams are a little less scary because they're a little more black and white, and I think that is, you know, the curious thing about the anima is their seductive power, and how things that we can really desire and crave can actually be very, very destructive. And there's a great word, and this I think goes for both animus and anima experiences. There's a great word in German. I wish I knew German. I won't butcher it, but it essentially, it's a long one, Aussie in Derkzung, something like this. And Jung uses that. It's often translated in English as analysis or encounter, but it really means it's used to when two parties, usually legal parties or business parties, come together and through a confrontation of negotiation, their distinctive qualities come out, and what doesn't seem so distinctive at first starts to really flesh out. And I think that's really crucial of anima dreams, is why are you so what is it about you that's so seductive, and what is it about you that's so dangerous? And kind of bringing, and also for the animus as well, like what is it for you that's so scary to me, and why are you ganging up on me, and how can I or we can use integrate, or we can use learn from or negotiate from, and what skills can I learn from you and bring into my life as well. And so I would say that's my experience of the animus. It too is numinous and enticing, but also potentially destructive.
You know, it reminds me, I noticed for myself, one of the, for me, a lot of the anima connection I initially made was through guided imagery in a number of groups. And it was interesting because for me, the anima came out in my imagery as a very animalistic kind of quality. It wasn't pretty nymphs. It was this sort of animalistic thing that was an aspect of me that was, you know, not coming out too much. So I actually brought that was me quite a while ago, doing the wild woman dance. And so we had a whole week long with John Abrams at Esalen Institute. And part of what we were doing was going ahead and just acting out these different feelings, images, energies that were emerging through the process, and really, you know, playing with them, acting them, and then sometimes in conflict. That was why I thought about that, because I agree with you in terms of the dynamism of the contact point that's often has sparks flying. It has conflict sometimes involved with it. And we tend to sort of like yin and yang is sort of this peaceful coexistence. In a lot of ways, it's not just peaceful coexistence. They slam into each other. And that's part of the energy. If things slamming into each other and throwing off sparks is part of the energy of the universe. And I think it's part of the energy of the opposites. And that's part of what we're talking about here, is just the energy of the opposites as they dance and hit and coalesce around each other and maybe separate for a while and then come back together into relationship. So it's it's that relationship between the conscious and the unconscious, the yin, the yang, the anima, the animus, the person to the person, the culture to the culture. To me, there are all multiple levels of how this interacts. So just thought I'd throw out that personal note.
Thank you. Paul, Paul, would you like to ask a question of the panel, or shall we go to the questions from the audience?
Let's go ahead and go to questions to the audience.
Okay. Roger, you're first. Let me just tell everybody the rules. So we've been doing these meetups for 3.5 years. We've followed 4 rules, which have worked really well for us. Number 1, raise your hand when you want to speak. You can raise your hand in 3 different ways. You can type your question in, or you can type in exclamation mark in the chat, or you can raise your hand in the Zoom app. 3 ways. Rule number 2, keep on topic. We're talking about Anima, Animus today. We'll, just keep on that. You can bring anything connected to that, but keep the focus on that. Number 3, be brief. There's a lot of people who have lots of interesting things to say. Whatever you say, keep it brief so that we can hear everybody. And number 4, feel free to disagree with anything anybody says, but do so courteously. So be courteous. So those are the 4 rules. All right. So it's going to be Roger first. Give me just a second here. So it's going to be Roger, Carl, Gang, Richard, V, John, Alex. That's the order. Roger, go ahead. When called upon to ask a question, go ahead, unmute yourself, ask the question and mute yourself. Let's not do any follow-ups. I want to get to as many questions as possible. All right, go ahead, Roger.
All right. Thanks, everyone, for the presentation. That was really interesting. I was actually, Paul, you kind of beat me to it because this is kind of where I was going to go with my question. But me and my girlfriend are huge fans of RuPaul's Drag Race. And I was really interested in your guys' opinion of things such as drag or flexibility with gender roles or experimenting with gender expression, and a growing interest in that. Do you guys see that as a growing interest in the exploration of the contra-sex or the dominant internal traits, or the ones that are unconscious?
I'll be brief. I think any expression, any realization of androgyny, is hygienic. Ultimately, it runs with a lot of risk, but I think any movement towards androgyny is hygienic.
Okay. Next question. If nobody else has anybody, is Gang. Gang, go ahead.
Oh, I believe I was next.
Oh, just a second. My mistake. Sorry, Carl. Okay. Carl, go ahead.
I was getting all ready.
All right, go for it.
No worries. I was curious if Carl Jung ever addressed the concept of gender in words, in language. And I'm referring specifically to some of the Romantic languages like French, Spanish, and Italian, which I believe have a gender to all objects, like the sun is masculine, but the moon is feminine, and so on and so on and so on. And I found that fascinating. I was wondering if Carl Jung ever addressed that.
Well, I can speak, if any other panelists can speak directly to the particular languages Carl mentions, I would love to hear that. But I think one of the interesting controversies, interestingly, out of Jung came from the translation. R.S.C. Fuller does the translation of the collected works. I think, German does not. German is more fluid, and Jung writes in German. And so some have argued that the gender, some of the what's considered critiqued by some as gender essentialism with Anima and Animus is actually a difficulty in translation. I also think it's important to realize that Jung is very intentional about words he uses in certain languages. For example, in the Red Book, he'll use English at certain points, he'll use German at certain points. Of course, he'll use Latin and Greek at certain points to make subtle distinctions. And so I think the fact that he wrote in gender most often, and most of his work is written in German, I think says something. So he would certainly been aware of those kind of differences, and I think looking into the language choices that Jung makes is a really interesting avenue of study. Something I'm very curious about. Thank you, Carl.
Okay, next question is by Gang. Gang, go ahead.
Yeah, I want to ask. I noticed like a lot of artists, actually, they have to have this animus, you know, both type of gender character to be able to be more creative. That's at least what I noticed. Even one of my friends mentioned, he said his sister is architect. He found a lot of architect men are more feminine and women are very masculine. So I have to wonder, is that because they were like combining with the other side of the animus that make them a part of creative work to happen?
The panelists, anybody who wants to answer the question, you can just go ahead and unmute yourself and answer.
I can say something quickly if you want. I mean, I know that, you know, there's a connection between the anima and the muse. You know, for the artist, the muse is like, you know, this inspirational force, you know, that kind of gives them this creative energy, you know, and I think, you know, that's very much part of like having that relationship with the unconscious, you know, for the artist is important, you know, to give them that connection with something that ultimately can sometimes be that you know, metaphorical. We talk, like Jung talks about, you know, intuition as being you know, perception via the unconscious, and I think, you know, to be in touch with that, you know, intuition in your art especially, you know, is you know, a thing which will help to express that which is also otherwise unexpressible, because I think that's part of what art is, you know, it's to express that which cannot in other words be put into some sort of form that you can express. So I think that's all I've got to say on that, really.
I can. Shrinkat, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. Panelists, I can't see all of you at once. So whenever you have anything to say, just unmute yourself and start speaking. That's good.
Just
go ahead.
Quickly, I think that's a provocative question, Jing. At least for me, I think it makes sense. I don't want to generalize, but in general, I think it makes sense that one's occupational choices. I think one can argue that one's occupational choices, you know, egoic will. I'm going to be this. I'm going to prepare myself for that. I think one can develop an argument that that's active imagination, or that's a projection. You know, one's occupational choices can be an expression, a realization of the contrasexual dynamisms, you know, that reside within oneself. Again, that's just a proposition, but I think it's provocative, and for me, there's a logic there. The occupational choices can be a way to express contrasexual dynamisms.
Thank you. Next up is Richard L. So it's going to be Richard L. V. Give me a second. Sorry, the chat window keeps moving here on me. Richard L, V, John R, Alex, and Jean next. Jean and then Brian. Okay, go ahead, Richard L. Richard? Okay, I can't, I don't know what's wrong. V, go ahead. You had a question. W-E-V. You need to unmute yourself to speak. Nope. Okay, let's go to the next one. John Roth, go ahead, John.
Can you hear me okay? I'm on a headset.
Yes, perfect.
Thank you. Just my simple observation was it would be interesting to me if any of the panelists off the top of the head could suggest a painting or a movie or a book or a characterization that demonstrates for them a strong anima dynamic. Richard, of course, mentioned a specific painting, and that's a lot of fun. But I'd be interested in more tangible examples if anyone can share those. Thank you.
I've got one. I would check out Groundhog Day with Bill Murray. That's one of my favorite examples of the phenomenon of anima possession, circling around the same thing again and again to try to get the object of desire. That's one of my favorite examples, and an excellent film.
Since we're talking about films, my recommendation would be Hedgewick and the Angry Inch.
Richard or George? Go ahead, George.
I think for me recently, that film with Joaquin Phoenix, Her. I think that's a wonderful film to check out. I had to see like 3 times. I mean, my wife told me, "Where were you?" I got so excited about that film. And in terms of reading, I forgot to mention this earlier. It's an essay. I think it's volume 16. The Psychology of Transference. I think it's a wonderful articulation with regards to this projecting quality of anima and animus, in the other. So, Psychology of the Transference.
Just a minute. Would you put that book up again? I'd like to see it.
It's an essay. It comes from the Collected Works. I believe it's volume 16. I could double check.
Volume 16 of Psychology of Transference?
No, volume 16 is, I forgot the title, but this comes from volume 16. And the essay is called The Psychology of the Transference. It's available as an independent publication as well.
Thank you.
Richard.
Yeah, on that question, John Beebe is really into film and the examples of archetype and function within films. So interesting to, hopefully you might mention some of this stuff next week if he's joining the panel. But he's talked to me about Peter Pan, the film, and how he sees the character of Wendy in Peter Pan. It's the Disney cartoon, I think. Wendy is an anima character. That's one of the examples I know he's given specifically about anima in cartoon in this case, in animation. But there you go.
Thank you, Richard. Let me see who's next. Give me a second here. Next up is Alex. Alex, go ahead.
Great, thanks, Shrikant. This is a question for any of the panelists. I'm wondering if you could speak about the concept of the mystical marriage of the masculine and the feminine. So I've heard that is in some ways the goal of this integration process, and I'm wondering if there are any techniques, anything to kind of further that process. And actually, part of that is I'm wondering about is there an embodiment perspective to Jungian psychology, and are there any techniques associated with that?
Well, it's an absolutely fascinating question, Alex. So you're right to say that the mystical marriage or the mysterium conjunctionis is absolutely huge, especially for Jung, especially at the end of his life, and it's an immense topic. For practical techniques, I would say I love this where you're going with the embodiment. But since we're talking about the mystical marriage, if you're interested in embodiment, I think it would be kind of and bringing the idea of the mystical marriage to bear. It would be about kind of holding that tension between intellectual knowing and physical knowing, and finding the marriage between two of those things. That could be a practical example or a practical idea of trying to play with this model with you. And what I would suggest to do something, there's this great exercise from the Catholic monastic tradition called Lectio Divina, which is meditative reading. And what I would do is I would slowly read the book Song of Songs and try to embody that. And if you can embody the Song of Songs, that would be my suggestion. And that's going to be a very creative process, obviously.
Anybody else wants to respond? Go ahead, Richard.
Yeah, so the marriage, I mean, it's the metaphor. I think, in Beebe's work, he's talking about the spine of the personality that one of the others alluded to earlier, and that, that through creating this relationship with our unconscious and with our animus, it creates what he calls integrity and depth. You know, it really creates a kind of spine, a solid spine for the personality. And you know, on his model, you know, does give us this kind of typological way of understanding what aspects it is that are there to be discovered and connected with. So for me, it's my inferior function is extroverted sensing or extroverted sensation. So it's very much about embodiment for me. You know, that function, it was repressed and cut out of my life, and that brought me out of touch with my body and the physical surroundings and just being in the environment. So for connecting with my anima is really about it's all about embodiment. It's all about being. So in the moment, in the physical world. For some others, it might be a different challenge. So with different functionality, you know, it can be very different challenges. So I wouldn't say it's always the same thing that you need to do. And even saying that it's what you need to do is kind of, it's a tricky one. I wouldn't say anyone wakes up one day and goes, right, I'm going to integrate my anima or animus. You don't do that. You know, I think the point is it's all about the timing, and that's, you know, it's all about, it will come when the time is right. It will come through to the surface, and it's being aware and listening to when, you know, that arises in your life as a need, or in dreams, or in some way, you know, that there's something that needs to be done and that something that needs to be found. I think it's that, if anything, yeah, maybe in the body, knowing what those signs are, you know, listening for signs that something is stirring in the psyche and something needs to shift. And that could be what is needed. And the anima and animus could be a big part of that.
I agree. It's certainly a shift, a psychic shift. Jung addresses though that question and its implications in volumes 12, 13, and 14, particularly in 14 that Brian referred to, Esteeming Cunyantones. And for me, those volumes, they're like 800 pages each. They have overwhelmed me, particularly volume 14. Good luck with that. Who asked the question? Alex? But in terms of embodiment, I would say be careful, brother. Make sure you develop good relationships. The reason I say that is because personally, my encounter with the animus and this marriage has divorced me from my family for years. And you know, it's a process. So I think these type of encounters can be overwhelming and it can challenge the stability of your ego. So make sure that you are operating on firm ground, you know, tierna cornita, before you encounter that chaotic realm. So the embodiment of the contrasexual self can be quite overwhelming. So make sure you have strong anchors.
Thank you, George. I missed two questions in text, so I'm going to ask them now, one from Carmen and one from V. Carmen asked, how would the anima animus projections work towards the same sex or gender?
You know, it's I'll jump on this because in a way it kind of brings us full circle. We were talking at the beginning about the difference between the actual physical genders and the concepts of masculinity and femininity. We're also talking about how to work with that and our experiences with that. So I had the unique experience of being born and growing up in San Francisco, California. And as an adolescent, all of my friends were these, you know, tough, hard-drinking Irish Catholic guys. And that was how you're supposed to be. That's how guys are supposed to be. And then I got to the age where I realized there are other neighborhoods in San Francisco. And there are men in those neighborhoods who don't act in those ways. And they manifest other aspects of their character. And so by the time I was in my early 20s, I had a lot of gay friends and, you know, went to a lot of, you know, kinds of interesting events and really had very much changed how I saw masculinity, femininity, experienced it in my own soul, in my own psyche. And that also put me very much on the outside of traditional culture, and all of my relationships changed, my friendships changed. As you were saying, Jorge, when you start playing with those energies, you start diving deeper into yourself and bringing things out. You don't know where it's going to go. You don't know how it's going to damage your persona, ego relation with the rest of the world. And so you may find yourself losing all sorts of things that were of value to you, and without knowing what's coming next, with not knowing where the value is. So you have to feel drawn towards it. It has to drag your soul out of the comfortable, the known, the familiar, the rewarding, into something else. So it's like you say, it's almost like if you go looking for it, you probably ain't gonna find it. It's gotta drag you down into the cauldron. That's where the real connection happens. That's where and whether it's I agree with what people were saying about full integration is probably never possible in this lifetime, but relationship with, and maybe sort of a tapping into, because these are sources, again, but sources of psychological energy. Because if I'm only living from that superficial, I got to do things the way I'm supposed to do them so I can get a good job and win a good wife and have good, all that stuff. If that doesn't pull my energy out, then it's a level of lived deadness. So the question is, what is pulling you? What is energetically pulling you in some other direction, some other aspect of who you are? And this is where the contrasexual can come into play. Because if a big aspect of sort of who I am that I'm not tapping into energetically is symbolized, is imagized in a contrasexual way, something that we think of as a feminine aspect given my maleness, or masculine if I was female, then I think that's you got to follow that energy, but you got to be fully cognizant of what you can lose and what the negative things that it can do in one's life. So you really got to be drawn to it.
Richard?
Yeah, interesting question about the projection towards the same sex or gender. I mean, it's the parts of our psyche or mind that create metaphor, qualitative connections, that does this projection stuff. I mean, and I really want to reiterate that. I'll say, if I didn't mention it, that I do think we all clearly have masculine and feminine, or in the yin and yang sense, qualities, whether we're men or women, and to differing degrees. And some men are in this sense qualitatively more feminine than some women, and vice versa. These aspects qualitatively can vary very much, and we've all got both of them within us. So very much, if you were projecting, animus qualities, these qualities of kind of like over forcefulness and tyranny and so on onto another person, if they have those qualities or close enough to them that they become a hook for that projection, then yeah, you might as well project it onto them, because that's the whole point of projection. You find something that's similar enough, that's good enough to hold that projection, but you don't do it consciously, but it happens, and then it forms the projection. So very much it could be, I'd say, a man, a woman, it doesn't really matter. One thing is really interesting that John Beebe has said, and I know he works a lot with homosexual people in San Francisco, and he said from the dreams of those people he's worked with, he seems to have found that still, for some reason, that the anima or animus that appears in dreams generally still seems to be the opposite gender, like man or woman gender, which is interesting. That's something he's mentioned in a previous webinar. So, but in terms of projection, I know someone's asking a question there. I've got a hand up, but
okay.
Yeah, I'll stop
All
there.
right. Okay, so next question is from V. Again, I missed that. It was in the chat. I wonder, I'm going to read it out. I wonder whether Anima / Animus is had by Stone Age timeline had already existed by Stone Age, and whether Carl Jung's Anima Animus have the same meaning in a polyandrous, matrilinear, and matriarchal societies. Does anybody want to take that?
That's a great question. And this is really, I'm gonna, not from left field, but probably out of the ballpark. However, that's a great question. I do subscribe to the notion that the birth of the ego is always a fragmentation of the psyche. So having said that, I think, yes, there was some sort of, again, let's not get stuck with labels, but in terms of an approach to psyche, I think in Stone Age societies, Jung talks about participation mystique, you know, but even there, I think there's a fragmentation of psyche. So yes, I would say as dynamisms, as denizens of the collective unconscious, these transpersonal entities have existed, and I would listen to the argument that Stone Age humanity did existentially experience fragmentation of the psyche. Yeah.
Do you mind if can I comment on this one as well? Yeah, excellent. So this is a very thought-provoking, fascinating question. I think I kind of want. I think Jung as a social psychologist is a bit underrated. If you take a look at his work in the Introjection to the Golden Flower, he talks about how if you're going to start meditating as someone in industrial European society, you have to take into account what I like to call the cultural personal unconscious. So we've got the kind of your cultural upbringing, and clearly in the distinction that our friend with the question made, there's going to be a different kind of cultural manifestation of these fundamental events that happen. But I think, for Jung, I think we can argue that some kind of projection making factor is going to be latent in the psyche of someone throughout time. But it could be hard to recognize that the distinct cultural manifestations of that could look wildly different. But definitely that archetype is going to be present if there's validity to this model.
Thank you, Brian. Next question is from Jung. Jung, go ahead.
Hi. So I saw an article from one of his books. I think it was called Animus Rising, Mothers, Daughters, and the Psychic Phallus. And it said, this is a quote, as a self-image, the Animus is in effect a wonder child. And then he mentions Hermes being an example of that, and also Christ. And I want to add that I was a little surprised to hear this, because I think about the inner child as connected to the body and the feminine energy. And maybe I'm not a deep enough reader of Jung yet, but my sense is the masculine energy in supporting the inner child is what leads to individuation. So I wondered if you had any comments about all of that.
Well, one quick comment on it is that the Christ figure is based on partially on a vegetative religious cycle. So he's really often seen, I remember, he is the child. He's not the Godhead, he's the child of Christ, and is sometimes seen as sort of in essence, the consort of the vegetable female. Does that make sense? So the foundation of consciousness is feminine, and Christ serves as the temporal manifestation of that, where it's the yearly vegetative cycle So he arises, he lives, he dies, he goes underground, he comes back. So it's the yearly physical manifestation of the deeper foundation of life itself, which is more fundamentally feminine in nature. So that's a bit of the connection there.
Okay.
Wonderful. Does anybody else want to speak on this? All right.